The Tri-Blaster was made in 2005 by Trump Grand Manufacturing and was distributed by DreamGear. It is a plug-and-play console, which is at the same time also a controller, a light gun and a fishing rod. Technically, it's a NES-on-a-chip design, which has a game cartridge soldered to its mainboard. The Tri-Blaster has 72 pre-installed games. The system is closely related to the PowerJoy Streamline, which was also made by Trump Grand Manufacturing. The main unit looks very unconventional as for its threefold functionality. The controller portion of this system features a PlayStation-style D-pad and two face buttons. Because of the placement of the fishing rod crank, the access to the face buttons is inhibited, and thus the unit is awkward to hold as a standard controller. Turning the crank will briefly press A in a clicky manner thanks to an elaborate mechanism. In the middle of the controller is a digital joystick which is redundantly mapped to the directions. On top of the joystick are buttons for start and select and a reset switch. The latter is necessary to reassess the main menu after a game was launched. Under the large bulge is a rumble unit which is activated upon trigger press. The feedback is surprisingly effective and snappy. Next to the face buttons are placeholder windows with LEDs underneath, which are linked to the rumble feedback. The trigger uses a very low quality microswitch-like design. In my unit, this switch broke within the first few hours of usage. Under the barrel is the on-off switch. The unit is powered by a 9V center negative power supply, which is connected via a DC barrel socket at the cable. Two LEDs in the front of the gun indicate whether the console is running or not. On the handle is a socket to which a second controller can be connected for multiplayer action. The controller is very much reminiscent of a SNES controller, but being made for a NES, it of course just has two face buttons. The second row of buttons offers turbo button variants of A and B. The controller looks terrible as for the sloppy paint job and has lots of warping. But in all reality it feels good and is nice to use. Sadly, a keyed non-standard modification of DE9 was used, and thus it's difficult to connect other controllers to the console or to use the present controller for other systems. From what I can see, most of the games are made by Nice Code Software. Very few of the games have bugs and many of the games are actually fun. This isn't an Action 52 situation at all, where a game cartridge was filled with non-functional and broken games. Of the 72 provided games, just 4 are light gun games. I will carry on to cover those 4 games in detail and then speak about hardware issues and fixes. Of the remaining games, I will just briefly mention a few highlights towards the end of the review. My personal favorite of the Tri-Blaster is called Barroom Shootout. In the game's story, the player is a police officer who raids a bar in which the so-called Ripers gang is operating. The player has a stock of 20 lives, which are grouped as 4 bars consisting of 5 hearts each. If all lives are consumed, the game ends and the score screen appears. This screen behaves buggy and the scores aren't saved. Most enemies take 2 shots to get killed. Each of the 6 levels features a boss fight at the end. The game starts off in a bar. The player is then brought to a back alley. Next comes a warehouse. A train station is the location of the next level. Finally, the player fights on a harbor, where the last battle takes place on a freighter. If the 2 players option is chosen, the game offers a continue, which lets the second player start from the level in which the first player died. If player 1 beats the game, the remaining stock of lives is inherited by the second player. The game has pretty graphics and plays well, but lacks music. Similarly to 3-in-1 Supergun, which I reviewed in episode 16, the game is untypically easy on the eyes, as it doesn't draw right hitboxes over the targets, but instead changes the sprite of interest to white during hit detection. Hunter is a duck hunt style game. It offers a play mode with just one duck and another one with pairs of ducks. The game cycles through 5 individual levels. The sound effect for the shots is lifted straight from Duck Hunt. Similarly as in the original, the dog will laugh at the player if the ducks are missed. A big difference, however, is the capacity of the used gun. 5 shots are available instead of the usual 3. The flight patterns of the birds seem very stiff and linear. The graphics are pretty and the music is cheerful. Personally, I'm put off by the lack of a difficulty curve or its low slope if there actually was one. Jumping Fish is again a duck hunt style game. 2 modes offer either 1 fish or 2 fish per trial. 3 shots are available each trial. A delightful bird dives into a pond and chases fish, which eventually jump to the surface of the water. If the whole round of trials is completed, the bird can be seen swimming by with a fish in its beak. If the player fails the round, the bird swims by without a fish. The diversity of fish is very high, which kept the game fresh to me for a bit longer. Sadly, the difficulty of the game doesn't seem to ramp up, or at least doesn't noticeably. From what I can tell, the game uses own sound effects and menu music. I like the art style of the game much and would say it's my second favorite light gun game on the system. Shoot UFO is a clone of the skeet shooting portion of Nintendo's Duck Hunt. It plays very similar and lifted most of its sound effects and music. Instead of clay pigeons, UFOs are shot. The targets always appear in pairs. Like in the original, per trial 3 shots are available. Shoot UFO is one of the few games on the system without a start screen, which makes it seem to be a rushed effort. The game looks and plays fine, but the lack of challenge makes this game become dull very quickly. That the light gun lacks sights was very annoying to me. My system struggled a lot registering hits, and the lack of sights made it a whole lot more difficult to find the cause. The problems were most notable in Hunter, where at the beginning of each trial immediately a shot was fired, and in Shoot UFO, where the system heavily struggled to read the trigger. The problems ended up being caused by a faulty switch. In a working unit, ground is connected to the common terminal, trigger to normally open, and a reporter signal to normally closed. In my unit, the normally closed terminal was broken and acted as a momentary switch, which was connected to common just at a certain trigger pressure point, but not when being fully actuated nor released. Knowing that it would be a large hassle to replace the switch for a microswitch, as the actuator would need adapting to, I decided to change the 3-pole switch layout for a 2-poles layout using a simple circuit. It worked very nicely for me, but sadly after another day of playtesting, the connection quality between common and normally open also started to degrade massively. I then replaced the stock switch for a proper miniature microswitch. After lots of tinkering with the shape of the actuators, I ended up with a setup I really like. That the trigger switch of this console didn't last longer than a few hours though is very alarming. I don't think that the Tri-Blaster is the best way to enjoy the included games. I would rather recommend to get the DreamGear game station, which came with a proper light gun, desoldering the game card and put it onto adapter board to play it on a real NES, or directly buy the PowerJoy SuperMax 60 cartridge, which contains many of the Tri-Blaster games. Emulation enthusiasts will find many of the nice Code Software games on PowerJoy ROMs. I will conclude this review with a small overview of the highlights of the other games on the system. Depending on the version of the game, deer stalking is sometimes controlled by light gun. On the Tri-Blaster, however, the controller must be used. Obviously, there are fishing games on the system which make use of the crank. Of these, I like fishing the most. It offers multiple modes, locations, baits, and lets the player choose the time of day. The presentation is great. The graphics are very appealing and the music is good. If an animal bites the hook, the player has to turn the crank to decrease the depth meter value to 0 before the red bar completely fills and the prey escapes. Some of the contained games are heavily influenced by popular titles. There are 2 Tetris tributes, a Bomberman game, a Breakout clone, a Sokoban type in which snowballs are shifted, and another one in which symbols are matched. The latter is called Dringle, and it's my favorite non-light gun game on this compilation. Other than that, I especially like the versions of Snake, Riversea, and Minesweeper. Overall, I think the Tri-Blaster is a fun device, but certainly not the best way to play the nice Code Software made games. I am disappointed that the controls for player 1 feel much worse than the second player pad, and that player 1 lacks turbo buttons. Furthermore, the quality issues with the trigger hinder me to recommend this system. The box looks nice and interesting. A see-through window displays the actual console. Curiously, the designer messed up the German flag and used purple instead of black. This is the end of the review. My name is Ben. I thank you for viewing.